Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fair Housing 101 training for rental professionals. This training is sponsored by a generous grant from the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, or MISTA. So we thank them for allowing us to provide this content with no charge. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I'm an Education Outreach Coordinator with the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. And joined with me today is my director, Liz Keegan, the Director of Education and Outreach. We have some housekeeping things to go over before we get started today. So everyone's audio is muted and everyone's camera is off, so we cannot see or hear you. Any questions need to be put in the Q&A. We will answer any clarifying questions throughout the presentation, but at the end, we'll answer some more detailed questions. This training is being recorded and will be available on YouTube after the training. And then there will also be a short break halfway through. So don't worry, we're not going to make you guys sit through this 3-hour training without a break. And then the big thing that everyone needs to remember is that to verify your attendance, you must complete the evaluation that we will provide at the end of the training by tomorrow, March 5th by 5 p.m. You will receive an email that verifies your attendance. We are no longer providing physical certificates of completion, so please save this email for your records. You will get that email most likely next week, so it will not be immediately after completing your evaluation. So please complete that evaluation by tomorrow by 5 p.m. And the link should automatically appear in your webinar or in your browser as soon as it ends, or it should be up now, but we'll also post the link in the chat.
Bree, we're hearing there's echoing for some of our participants.
Okay.
Just
If there
want
is,
to.
yeah, folks, if everyone's experiencing it, I can check. But for somebody that mentioned it, you are logged in twice, so I would make sure that you don't have Zoom up twice. Because actually, we did that earlier. Liz did that when we were testing it, and she had to.
100% did that myself already today, so I understand, but do make sure to check for that. There were a few people
Okay. Yeah.
that
So
noted
just
it.
make
So
sure you aren't. Make sure you're not logged in multiple times. Um, Here is our information. Again, my name is Brianna Miranda. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator, and Liz Keegan is joined with me today, Director of Education Outreach. And then on the back end, Lindsay Owens, they are doing any of the technical assistance. So if you need any help, or if you're having trouble getting in, or you have staff that are trouble getting in, please feel free to email them. Their email is provided in the handout. And if you did not get the handouts, Lindsay has posted a link in the chat, so please check for that. And again, thank you again to Mishta for allowing us to have this presentation free of charge. And then just a reminder, attendance will be taken via the link. Attendance will not be taken in the chat. Just remember to do that link at the end, or click that link and complete that to get your attendance information. So today we will be covering a lot of things over the course of 3 hours. We'll talk about who we are, what housing discrimination is, what fair housing laws are, what protected classes are under the laws, application of those laws. We'll go over testing and some other things there. So questions, evaluations, and a conclusion. To start us off, we do have a poll, and I will launch that here just to get to know you all a little bit more and kind of get an understanding of where everyone is based on their knowledge. Okay. This first one here, on a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of familiarity with fair housing. I'll give about another 30 seconds here. And again, to help with the echo, please make sure that there is no other Zoom opened in any of your web browsers. Um, you might have the Zoom app open and then it might be open in a web browser. So just make sure that you don't have multiple screens up. That is generally the echo because other folks aren't hearing it. So I don't think it's a my audio issue. Or should I say not everyone is hearing it? Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Share those results. So we have a nice mix in this room or in this group, which is really, really great. So we have a majority of folks have some fair housing knowledge, which is really great. And then there is a percentage of you that do know a lot about fair housing. So please ask questions, clarifying questions throughout the presentation. And then if we don't get to questions, we'll try to answer as many at the end as possible. But you can always reach out after the presentation if you have any other additional questions. And then we have two more here. This one is testing the protected classes. So check all of the protected classes under federal fair housing laws: smokers, race, religion, sex, credit history, national origin, convicted felon, disability, adult with dependent children, and color. And if you're watching as a group today, you will have to kind of agree on your answers for today, but these are all anonymous and it is not graded in any way. Give folks about 20-ish seconds to get through them. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll, so feel free to get those last second answers in. I'm going to share those results. All right. Good job, everyone. So I'll go through what the right answers are for the federal fair housing laws. Race is a federal fair housing law, religion, sex, national origin, disability, adult with dependent children is families with children, and color. So those are all the federal fair housing laws or protected classes under federal fair housing laws. So not included are the smokers, credit history, and convicted felon. Okay, we have one more to do, and then we'll dive into the content. This is a true or false, I should say three more, but in one swoop. The first one, anyone can file a fair housing complaint, a resident, a visitor, or property manager, true or false. Number two, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing laws. True or false? And the last one, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms. True or false? Since there's three here, I'll give a little bit more time to get these completed. Okay, I'll give about 10 to 15 more seconds here for folks to respond. Alrighty, get your answers in. I'm going to end it and then share the results. Okay, good job, everyone. So for the first one, anyone can file a fair housing complaint. That is true. Anyone can file a fair housing complaint. There is no restrictions. And here at the Fair Housing Center, we also accept anonymous complaints as well. For the second one, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing laws. I will agree with 88% of you. That is false. Maintenance staff can be held responsible for stating a preference. And number three, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms. And I will agree with 80% of you there. That is false. This can be a risk under familial status discrimination. So, as a property manager, you do not have the right to inquire about that. There are some exemptions. I know there's some programming so that may have that, but as a private landlord with no federal funding, or state funding, that is not a right you have. Okay, so that was it for the polls for now. We will test your knowledge throughout the training. So now we're going to dive into who we are at the Fair Housing Center. The Fair Housing Center of Western Michigan is a private nonprofit. We were founded in 1980. Our mission is to ensure fair housing choice and equal access to housing opportunities for all. We work towards this by providing comprehensive fair housing services. This includes education, like today, and we provide education to the community as well as the housing industry. We do outreach to the community and to different agencies. We do research, advocacy, and enforcement. Core to this work is really the understanding of where you live impacts every aspect of your life and how you live. So the ability to choose housing free from discrimination is extremely important in that aspect. At the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, we lead with education. We're seeking to prevent housing discrimination whenever possible. We are not an enforcement authority. We do not have any practicing attorneys on staff. So with that being said, information today is not legal advice. If for legal advice, please consult an attorney. And the information provided today is for educational purposes only and is current and to the best of our knowledge, but could change at any time. And then just another note, anyone can report housing discrimination. So this is, again, just an overview of the type of education we provide. We provide education to the industry, such as yourselves. Without cooperation from the industry, we can't accomplish our mission. We really rely on self-policing and a personal commitment to fair housing. We provide education to home seekers, so people are aware as for their fair housing rights as they seek homes, and then generally just the public overall, knowing your rights and obligations. And then enforcement is the other part of this. We do have Lindsay, Liz, and I are on the education team, and then we have an enforcement team that is separate from us. Ideally, enforcement would not be necessary. However, laws and education aren't always enough. So enforcement is necessary, and it involves complaint taking, investigation, analysis of information, and if warranted, working for toward a resolution. The word fair is very subjective, understandably so, but at the Fair Housing Center, we only focus around fair housing laws and housing discrimination. We do not do anything related to landlord-tenant matters. We don't teach homebuyer classes or credit counseling. We don't work on affordable housing issues strictly. However, they are intertwined with our work. We don't handle building code and maintenance issues. We don't do foreclosure prevention, and we don't offer or refer housing due to the nature of our work. The Fair Housing Center of West Michigan is funded through various ways. We have many contracts with the city, counties, state, and federal government to provide fair housing services. We also have a membership drive. So if you are interested, we will have information at the end, but you can become a member. And then we have our annual Fair Housing Workshop Series, which we just launched on Monday. That is on April 22nd at 1 p.m. So you can go ahead and register for that if you are interested. We have 2 workshops, consecutive workshops for that day. We also do consulting and training, and then we do some special projects and have some various senior millages. This is a breakdown of the Fair Housing Centers across Michigan. We are all independent and do things differently. We're not under an umbrella of a group like the Boys and Girls Club or can't think of any other agencies, but we are all independent organizations. We are the Teal area, so we cover 38 counties, starting here and around the Holland area, all the way up and over to Lansing-ish, and then the UP as well. And then if you do call us with a complaint, we will refer you to the agency. So it's okay if you accidentally call the wrong agency. So what is fair housing? Fair housing law is the right of individuals to obtain housing of their choice, free from discrimination. And this is based on protected classes that are outlined by federal, state, and local fair housing laws. And we'll go over those protected classes here in a moment. Fair housing protects against discrimination in any type of housing transaction. Generally, we think of it in the rental and sales spheres because those are the transactional housing opportunities. However, it's also protects people in lending, insurance, zoning, and land use. If a space is intended for housing, it is protected under fair housing. So all aspects of housing. So these protected classes, Lindsay likes to call them protected characteristics, which I really like. It's a characteristic of ourselves. So at the federal level, we have race, color, religion, sex, disability status, which includes mental or physical disabilities, familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home. It's not a traditional family. It's a very broad definition of just children being in the household. And then national origin, where is meaning where somebody is from. We'll dive in deeper to each of these protected classes after the break, and then have some specific examples of discrimination within those each protected class. At the state level, we have an expanded definition of race. Protected classes are also covered under other laws as well. It's not just fair housing laws, but employment discrimination and education and public accommodations, things like that. So it's not just housing. So there is some of like the local ones in Grand Rapids are more pertinent to employment maybe than over housing. With that being said, race was expanded to include hairstyles that are commonly historically connected to race. Age is also protected with the exception for certain types of senior housing, excuse me. Sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression are also protected newly in, I believe, 2023 or 2024. And then marital status, whether or not somebody's married, widowed, singled, or divorced. And then source of income, which is a new one that went into effect a year ago. And that's only in rental housing, however. And again, like I said, we'll dive into these. And then there's some additional protected classes may vary based on where you live. So it's really important to know, to understand the protections for your location. So if you manage multiple properties across different counties or different cities, it's really important that you're aware of that protected classes may change between those properties. And then we provided some links there where you could find those resources to figure out those local protections. The important and most biggest aspect of fair housing laws and housing discrimination is the difference in treatment. Fair housing laws require that everyone be treated equally. And so it is illegal for a person to be treated differently in a housing transaction because of a protected class. So the treatment has to be connected to that protected class. What types of things are illegal under fair housing? Like I said, it is all parts of the housing transaction world. So even in the advertising, steering, which is guiding someone towards certain housing opportunities instead of others, eligibility criteria, application, both documents and even the process itself, policy terms, conditions, discounts and specials, maintenance, access to amenities affiliated with the housing, and harassment is also illegal under fair housing, both intimidation and sexual harassment. What type of housing is covered under fair housing? Like I mentioned multiple times, all types of housing, any type of housing. So apartments, which we commonly think of, but even condo associations and homeowner associations, the board has to follow and their bylaws have to follow for housing laws. Mobile homes and manufactured homes, transitional housing and homeless shelters, colleges and dorms, group homes, adult foster care, public housing authorities, independent living, fee-based programs that provide a place to live, extended stay hotels. So there's a giant list here. We just wanted to really show you that it's all types of housing. And then we're going to go into some trends. So according to the National Fair Housing Alliance, in 2024, there were over 32,000 fair housing complaints. This was gathered through both private nonprofit fair housing organizations and federal and state agencies. So it's across the whole um, US. This is the data that the National Fair Housing Alliance gathered. This was a drop previously. However, we do want to note that there was a 5% drop in agencies available with the capacity to receive complaints due to changes in grant funding or delays in grant funding. Looking at the national data, breaking it down, disability was the highest allegation, or the number of cases, I should say, at over 17,000. And then next up was race, then followed by sex. So disability accounted for 55% of all the housing discrimination cases. Then when we look at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan's data, our data is pretty similar. Disability is our number one allegation of discrimination, and then followed by race and color. And then new this year, or new in 2025, I should say, source of income was our third largest allegation of discrimination. I would say most of it is due to the newness of the protected class, so it's important that we're understanding what that means. And then if we look at the data by transaction type, rental housing is our largest area where we see allegations. I mean, there's various reasons why that may be. It could be because of high turnover, lots of people moving in and out, it's larger amounts of people, but rental is our largest. Followed by reasonable accommodations or modifications. So we'll dive into what those are, but those are changes needed by a person with a disability for their housing. So oftentimes we are seeing people just not being allowed to do them or having difficulty getting those accommodations or modifications, barriers. So I covered all this information, and many of you are like, why should this matter to me? Well, we recognize that the importance of housing, equal housing opportunity, is just important overall. No one should face illegal housing discrimination. And overall, it's illegal. Illegal housing discrimination really precludes or limits certain populations' ability to obtain housing, thereby unnecessarily limiting the marketing of housing. Housing discrimination just has negative impacts on our communities. It can limit groups to different areas and to different communities, and can really just put unnecessary burden on folks. And then when we think about liability, you can still be held liable if you did not intend to discriminate. You can also be liable even if you're saying it was my First Amendment right. Fair housing comes first on that. So you can say what you want, but you can still be held liable for those things if you're discriminating. Liability is also not dependent on supervisor screening. If your supervisor asks you to discriminate and you do, you're still held liable. And then ignorance is no defense either. If you weren't aware of fair housing laws, which many folks aren't, you can still, again, be held liable and have a claim put against you. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who will cover fair housing laws.
Thank you, Bree. So we're going back into history, maybe a little bit further than you anticipated, although I do see some familiar names. So thank you all for logging on to get your annual fair housing information with us. What you may not realize if you're new to fair housing is that this is an element that we have tried to address upholding equal housing opportunity for a long time, beginning as part of Reconstruction Acts after the Civil War. We have two specific elements regarding real property, which is just a reminder that fair housing laws focus on real property, meaning dwellings or residential housing. And at the time, the language was gender neutral, but only males were allowed to exercise their rights under these laws. But as you can see, we have language upholding access to real property regardless of race. All persons in the U.S. have the same rights as white persons, and all persons have the full and equal benefit of all laws as enjoyed by white citizens. So what that means is that there is no exemption to allow for discrimination on the basis of race in housing. There are other exemptions that Bree has mentioned and that we'll talk a little bit more about, for example, senior housing, but there is no ability that allows for discrimination on the basis of race because those laws from the 1800s can still be used in court today. We're going to turn it over to a really powerful short video that fills in the rest of the history, building on those original laws up to the end of modern federal fair housing protections.
Few in the nation believed that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing anything.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President. Yes, sir. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here because it was a white community. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it. And we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
Of your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are of all time. Martin Luther King's come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
Fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs.
For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
Do you know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
So that brings us forward to the 1960s, where additional civil rights acts were passed. And in this moment in time, as you heard, there was an urgency to take action to add housing protections, which traditionally have been removed from civil rights legislations that had been passed to that point. It didn't change what had already come before it 100 years prior under Reconstruction Act law. It expanded it specifically and begins our list of protected classes or characteristics. So we have race, color, meaning skin color, religion, and national origin put into law in 1968. It also includes this important paragraph or section of the law, Section 804, that probably covers everyone on the call, regardless of what role that you play, because it talks about limiting any communications or making it illegal to have any preferences or limits in any communications, statements, and advertisements that discriminate. So this is a paragraph of what I call legalese, but essentially anyone who is a part of making, printing, or publishing. So writing, posting, placing an ad that is regarding a sale or rental of a housing dwelling that has any preference, limits, or discriminates based on any protected class or the intention to do so would be a violation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our advertising section, but this is kind of the basis for where that comes from. Then we jump forward to the 70s, where we add a prohibition against discrimination based on sex. Some laws at different levels use gender. The Federal Fair Housing Act at the time in 1974 added sex. And so generally we'll see an interchanged use of those terms in the law. And then we'll go into more detail about each of the protected classes in our second half and share case examples. I think I missed one there, Bree, thanks. In 1988, we added families with children and persons with disabilities. And also in 1988, we had enforcement mechanisms built into the law for the first time. So the first 20 years of fair housing law, cases had to be brought individually in the courts. But in 1988, we had the governmental authority established for the federal government and now state governments to help enforce the law. So our entity in Michigan that does that work is the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and they were kind of ahead of the curve. In 1976, we had our own fair housing laws that prohibited discrimination in housing, but also extended to employment, education, and public accommodations. This list under the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, or ELCRA for short, started in the 70s with marital status and age, but it has grown to include sexual orientation, gender identity or expression in 2024, and source of income in rental housing in 2025. Prior to that, I think it was 2023, we added for the first time a definition of race under the Crown Act. Oh, I thought that would be next. Sorry. We also have a compatible law for persons with disabilities. So this is similar to federal law. It is takes it, I'd say, maybe one step further to really encourage housing providers and landlords to make accommodations and modifications or changes that are needed by people with disabilities. So here's our Crown Act. 2023, I'm glad my memory on that was correct. We didn't have a definition of what race meant under law. And so that was specifically added and is inclusive of traits historically associated with race, meaning hair texture and protective hairstyles, for example, braids, locks, and twists. So again, these civil rights laws apply not only to housing, but education and employment and public accommodations. Crown Acts became very common across the country around this time, as there were multiple cases, including one here in Michigan, where a teacher cut a child's hair without permission from the family and sent the child home as a young Black student. And so that caused a lot of conversation and resulted in our Crown Act here in Michigan. Then in 2023, but going into effect, meaning it was law on February 13th, 2024, across the state, sexual orientation and gender identity protections were added as protected classes. Gender identity or gender expression was protected. Then we have the latest in 2025, source of income protections. This is kind of a part of an ongoing effort to help expand where the income can come from to help people pay for their housing. So we'll go into these areas in more detail, as I mentioned in our second half. But as this is new, we want to highlight the source of income protections are focusing really on benefits or subsidy programs that include dollars that can count towards housing. So that can be housing assistance, housing choice vouchers. Prior, they were called Section 8 vouchers. You still see that language. Other public assistance dollars, veterans benefits, Social Security or Supplemental Security Income, SSI, you might have heard of, any other retirement program income, and then income related to programs that are administered by federal, state, local, or nonprofit entities. So really focusing on benefit and subsidy program income under this new protection. So landlords are still allowed to require a certain income amount in order to rent out a unit, so people can establish that they are able to pay the rent on that unit, but they should not specify or limit where that money for the household or the individual is coming from. Some caveats of the law is that it is allowing for the source of income needing to come from legal sources and legal activities and on an ongoing basis. This obviously then doesn't protect for income that's coming from illegal activities. One thing that I can say is this is a new law. There is a lot of gray area. So we are looking at getting as many questions clarified as we can from the state, and so are they. A lot of our initial questions were answered with essentially case law will establish how the law gets interpreted in Michigan. So the information that we're going to share is training from a very risk-averse conservative standpoint to help people avoid violations of this new law as the protections become clearer as cases are brought and decided. So just want to share that with a caveat. There's also limits as to who is covered by this particular new protection. It exempts small landlords with fewer than 5 units in the state of Michigan. So that's 5 individual units, no matter how they're comprised. And then any housing agencies that are administering those benefits, handling vouchers, et cetera, they have to move their applications through within 30 days. So there's a time limit to keep things moving forward in order to utilize those benefits and get people housed. Other exemptions, I mentioned briefly senior housing, but another one in Michigan is that dwellings that have living quarters occupied or intended to be occupied by no more than 2 families living independently of each other. So picture a duplex. If an owner or a member of the owner's immediately family lives on one half of that property, they have some exemptions in Michigan only. The exemptions at the federal level is 4 units or more, but Michigan law covers more housing. And so it's really 2 units. And if you own any other properties outside of that, you lose this exemption. And then regardless of any exemptions, even a senior housing community that's 100% 62 and older, which is allowable under federal law, they cannot advertise or make statements in a discriminatory manner saying, no families with children, even though in practice, they have that exemption and can exclude that population. So we are very conservative in how we recommend people talk about and think about communications for housing because of this broad provision that leaves a little bit of gray area. I think I saw a comment or a question about, why can you say no smoking at a property, but can we talk about not having smokers as people? You'll hear us say over and over today, describe the property, describe your program, don't describe the people, because these advertising provisions are really broad. The safest thing to do is describe the policy, even though smokers aren't a protected class, that we just feel this is a best practice that helps people be consistent. Focus on your policy of no smoking versus advertising no smokers, because you're starting to describe people, and we want you to avoid that as a best practice. So our next slide. So there are multiple areas that have additional protections. They can use different language and terminology. For example, Grand Rapids within the city limits protects discrimination on the basis of medical condition. Largely in fair housing, that would be covered under disability protections that already exist at the federal and state level. But communities can put together whatever sort of local protections they want, and they will use some terms that need definition or use sex and gender, like I mentioned, interchangeably. Some of these laws have been on the books for decades and haven't been updated. Some are fairly new. So we see all sorts of different kind of references. So we'll kind of quickly review along the lakeshore. Holland within the city limits has education. You'll see height and weight on a number of communities, but again, you might recall I mentioned that the civil rights laws not only cover housing, where we generally don't see height and weight-based discrimination, but you might see that more, for example, in employment, which is part of these broader civil rights laws. Up in Traverse City, they have height and weight protections, and I think we have Kalamazoo and Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor has a lengthy list. We also, I want to highlight, have a page on our website with all of the West Michigan and Upper Peninsula protections. If you're looking for local law, we can also help you find that. Ann Arbor is under a fellow Fair Housing Center's jurisdiction, and so is Kalamazoo, but they have also expanded within their city limits these additional groups that have additional protections. So we spend extra time on our protected class lists because it's something that we really encourage you to get familiar with. Do your homework based on where you are working, where your company might send you to work, where the portfolio is represented so that you know all of the protected classes very well. Being very familiar with them helps you identify potential fair housing issues or areas where you want to think about, do we need to do something different to comply with fair housing? Do we need to do some homework to better understand fair housing here? So just a reminder to really focus on your protected classes. It's what we do at the center. Our first question is who is impacted? And if they are a protected class, then we know we've got to think about fair housing. So we encourage you to do the same. Here's a couple of free code libraries where you can look at different local governments and see what their local law might cover. We encourage you to check with your local fair housing center as well. There has been a several years worth of efforts to push forward a Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act. This was recently reintroduced in December of 2025. In one chamber, it went directly to committee. Another one, it's waiting to be assigned to committee. So this has been reintroduced and could be considered. And what it would do is prohibit landlords across the state of Michigan, if this is passed, in placing some limits on what they can consider for applicants' criminal history during tenant screening. There's a handful of cities in Michigan that have already passed such legislation, none in West Michigan in our service area yet at this time. However, if this state law comes to fruition, then obviously it would apply to the entire state. So we'll keep you posted on that. And now we're going to take a quick pause to hear a little bit more from you in terms of whether or not you are familiar if your property receives any federal funding or not. We included a yes, no, and an I'm not sure option. You may be new. This may be your first fair housing training. And it is okay to say you don't know, but it's important to clarify with your team members or management so that you understand again, what obligations you might have. Those of you who have been in this class with us before know what's coming. And generally that is when you receive any federal or sometimes state dollars, any program dollars, it comes with obligations. And so we want to have you be aware that if you are federally funded or you're covered by regulations that are attached to that money, then you've got a few more responsibilities, which we will talk about. I'll give another maybe 30 seconds here, maybe 20 seconds because they're coming in here. And again, these questions are anonymous and just more for interaction. If you can't get the answer to the box to pop up, that might be something in your security settings that's not allowing you to see it. But we'll share everything verbally and just kind of want to get a sense of who's in the Zoom room, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results here. So we have a mix. We've got 54% of you who said, yes, we have federal funding at our properties. 33% are what we consider part of the private housing market. There is no federal funding there. And 13% of you are going to go back and do your homework when the webinar is over and get the answer to this question. So thank you for playing along with those. Our next slide. We're going to talk about Violence Against Women Act protections, or VAWA for short. It is a law that has regularly been reauthorized by Congress. It provides specific protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Separate from gender protections which exist under the Fair Housing Act, VAWA applies specifically to federally funded properties. However, there are limited circumstances where fair housing gender protections may assist survivors of domestic violence in private housing. But this section is largely going to focus on VAWA information and best practices. We also included some links throughout our handouts, so make sure you received handouts. Lindsay's been putting information in the chat about finding those on our website if you didn't get the email. Victims or survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking cannot be denied admission or federal rent assistance just because they are or have been a victim or were threatened as a victim. They cannot be evicted or lose that rental assistance, again, because of that history or status, and they cannot be denied admission or rental assistance. They can't be evicted or lose any subsidies for housing for reasons related to the abuse that occurred, such as bad credit history and criminal history that might come up as a result of surviving these circumstances. VAWA applies to those who are applying for or who are already tenants in any of these programs. So again, we're kind of asking about that federal funding question. These are all examples of programs and property types. There's a lot of lingo in housing. So, this is an area that if you're not familiar, I encourage you to get more familiar. You can Google these terms to learn a little bit more about the programs so that you understand the obligations that come with the federal funding. But it's public housing, Section 8 or housing choice voucher programs, project-based or site-based Section 8 housing, and then special programs for the elderly or disabled, multifamily rental housing. It also covers unhoused programs across the continuum of care, or COC, emergency solutions grants dollars, which focus on sheltering unhoused folks, and many more. It requires that communities, apartments, properties honor abuse protection orders and any other court orders, such as a divorce decree, that address access to or control of the housing unit. That's really critical. The housing providers and communities need to inform individuals of their rights under VAWA and include that information in lease agreements. And VAWA does protect regardless of gender, so protect males and females. The name of the law has not been updated to reflect that, but that has been the case for a long time. And then specifically in situations where both the victim and the perpetrator are parties to the lease, so they're both on the lease, the law does allow for the apartment or the housing provider to bifurcate or split the lease in order to evict the perpetrator, the person who's violating the laws and perpetuating or conducting the abusive behaviors. This allows the person, the survivor, to remain housed. So MISHTA, again, who's funding this incredible training series for us at no cost, has several resource pages. They have a lot of information on their website, but I wanted to link specifically to their compliance page, which includes manuals, policies, and codes. And then also they have a page targeted towards housing choice voucher applicants and tenants with kind of rights-based information. So I encourage you to check out those links if you are covered by VAWA. So overall, again, looking at domestic violence a little bit broader, you do not want to deny admission to anyone based on their status as a survivor of domestic violence. Again, do any sort of eviction action or terminate a lease based on criminal activity directly relating to the domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, unless the housing provider or the community can show and demonstrate specifically with documentation that an actual or imminent threat to other tenants, nearby residents, or those employed at or providing services to the property would be under that threat if the lease was not terminated. So there's very specific processes and procedures to follow. There's forms to reference. So I encourage you again to visit the MISHTA resources. How can housing providers assist victims who have experienced domestic violence and other types of dating and sexual violence? It's a good idea always to make sure properties are well lit, safe, and secure. focus on elevating repairs that pose safety issues. This is going to be a best practice across the board, obviously, for broken locks and windows, broken doors. If a unit cannot be secured, that is clearly a higher priority maintenance order, but especially so in situations like this. Staff may need to acknowledge domestic violence protection orders and help with enforcement, participating in the process to exclude, for example, the violent person from the premises or assist in the pressing of criminal charges if needed. You want to be very cautious with any survivor addresses, contact information, private information. You can't give that out without release from the tenant. And it's important to recognize that an instance of domestic violence is not a lease violation. There are other laws to be aware of that we're not focusing on today, but again, pertaining to our question of whether or not you have federal funding at your property. If you do, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act does protect qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in our second half in our disability protections, but it kind of changes how much responsibility the housing provider with that federal financial assistance has to take in allowing for accommodations and modifications. Title VI, again, tied to that receipt of federal financial assistance, prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin in any programs and activities covered by that. ECOA, or the Equal Credit Opportunity, prohibits creditors from discriminating against most of the same protected classes that exist at the federal level. And then Housing for Older Persons Act allows for 2 age restrictions, 55 and older and 62 and older, that we'll talk more about in our second half. We focus on these protected classes, as I mentioned, not only as a tool to comply with fair housing, but also I just want to illustrate if a group is not protected based on the geography and the funding of the housing, then there are no protections that exist. So bad credit or having tattoos, communities may choose to put laws into effect at the local level, but those are not protected at the federal and state level. We'll talk a little bit more about criminal history screening best practices that have emerged as a result of case law in a special screening section. Looking at now getting into the nitty-gritty with advertising, messaging, and communications. Oh, great, we have another poll to hear from you all. Okay, that looks like that has popped up for everyone. True or false? A newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. What do you think? True or false? We did not give you an I'm not sure option, so you've got to choose one. And we'll give about 30 more seconds here. Maybe a little less because we've got some folks who are fast on the draw for this one. Again, a newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. True or false? Okay. And a good amount of fast draw answers on that one, so I will go ahead and end the poll here now. And share that 90% of you said false. And I agree with the 90% here. We really discourage any descriptions of the type of people or the perfect tenant or the ideal resident. The safest thing to do under fair housing is to describe the property and not the people. We'll get into a little bit more about why that is. First of all, it's prohibited. Here's our famous paragraph again, Section 804 of the Fair Housing Law, that prohibits any sort of limit, preference, or discrimination based on any of the protected classes and any notices, statements, or advertising, whether we're selling or renting housing. This provision is very broad, as I mentioned earlier. It includes promotional materials, newspaper and internet advertisements, and verbal statements. We also communicate by chat, by social media, by email, by voicemail, by text message. That is all communication that you want to have your fair housing hat on as you engage in that part of your business. Some examples of what not to do. If you recall, I said ideal for is a problem, perfect for is a problem. And here we have a series of very short statements, but clearly state preferences on who the housing provider is looking to house. And typically what we see here is we're looking for people who, households without children. We have some age preferences that are not allowed. And as I mentioned, if you recall, even a senior housing community couldn't state that they were looking for an elderly couple, for example. What they can say is that they are a 55 and older community or a 62 and older community. But any other sort of details like these are problematic. Here's a few more where we had ads, which many of these were real ads that we have found in our history that said you can only have a maximum of 2 children, which is not allowed. Or again, preferences for college students, single people, or retired couple. This last bullet, some of you might recognize this was kind of an infamous case that HUD took that did find for the individual who experienced the discrimination, who knew that she did not have to provide a picture of herself because of her fair housing rights, and toured the property and was further discriminated against based on statements that the landlord made. So all violations of the fair housing law. We also want to think about how our messaging reaches into the community. There's a lot of targeted advertising, especially with social media and media platforms. So we do not want to see any sort of advertising that just doesn't provide certain segments of the population or housing consumers information about available opportunities. We also see this happen where people get targeted because they're perceived to be more vulnerable for predatory products or services. And that would be a violation. Discouraging or deterring potential consumers. You don't want any negative information out there. So you want to use caution there. You don't want to advertise different prices and conditions, especially if they're on the basis of any protected characteristic. That can be problematic. And you don't want to have language steering home seekers to or away from any particular neighborhood. And sometimes we do see even the advertisers themselves charging higher amounts to show ads to what they consider to be desirable consumers that can fall along protected class lines. So there can be large ripple effects to advertising. So we don't want to see ads, for example, that would be targeted to predominantly Black neighborhoods that say things like no criminal records and good credit only, while ads from the same company in white neighborhoods wouldn't include that information. That would be a violation. Another one would be targeted mortgage ads sent to men that has detailed information on current rates, while the ad that's sent to women says getting a mortgage is easy and doesn't include that important information on current rates. Not equal treatment. Here's an example from an outside of Michigan with some promotions that include language about cooking smells, which are tied to national origin protections. There have been cases in the past where people have been treated differently based on their national origin related to cumin, curry, oregano, other types of cooking, other oils. And so that using that language in an advertisement is not a best practice. And I don't know why they have a Yoda head in the egg carton. I've never figured that out. So very confusing messaging, doesn't tell us anything about the housing available and includes fair housing risk. So overall, not a great example. Human models are also a part of advertising. This is something that many communities like to utilize, but it is something that takes effort. You can see here, this was all free clip art that we found, but finding images of human models, pictures of people that represent the full diversity of the protected classes is the best practice, and that can be challenging to do. It takes time and effort, and sometimes you even have to buy the images. You should have a little chart here about the risk of portraying people versus simply portraying the housing units and the properties available. If you show no human models, then there's no indication, preference, limit, or discrimination. Instead, you focus on the rooms and the units, the features, the amenities, the ambiance, the services. If it's program-based housing, you can talk about program requirements. But as we move down the arrow there and start showing people, you don't want to have selective representation of people. Many times we find when people are using human models, we find cases where everyone portrayed as white or one race, and that increases the risk of violating fair housing laws. So the safest thing, No human models. This would include caricatures and images that are meant to represent people as well. Avatars, illustrations, things like that. So if there are human models, it needs to be more inclusive of, as I mentioned, as many protected classes as possible. There's also affirmative fair housing marketing obligations that come with federal or state funds, so something to check into. Again, MISTA is our partner for offering this education. They require the sites and developments that are under their financing to maintain a current approved affirmative fair housing marketing plan, or AFHMP, on site. So that plan is a marketing strategy that's designed to attract buyers and renters of all majority and minority groups, regardless of sex, disability, familial status, or presence of children, etc., to assisted and insured rental projects and sales dwellings as they're being marketed. So I included a document here with the instructions. I encourage you, if you're subject to this obligation and you have MISTA funds, to review the instructions, because it's a nice step-by-step document, but we'll kind of do a higher level review here. So in terms of affirmatively marketing, we want to think about who might be least eligible or likely to apply to a property, and reach out intentionally to that community, making sure that these dollars and these programs are reaching the intended populations for assistance. We want to see outreach, which outlines special measures to attract those populations once they've been identified. Of course, you want to document all steps and work undertaken in this effort, and the instructions and sample documents outline how you can do that. You want to also measure, is this successful or not? Is the outreach that we're doing reaching the intended targets? I've talked to communities who have said, we send 1 or 2 letters. And I can say anecdotally, that's not going to be sufficient. So it takes work and planning and follow through. And it's also important that there's staff ability to know fair housing laws and work on and uphold this marketing plan under their fair housing knowledge. These plans should be reviewed every 5 years or so, or whenever the local community development jurisdiction, for example, the city of Grand Rapids, Wyoming, those are community development block grant, or CDBG designated governmental jurisdictions. So they have the obligation to do regular con plans or consolidated plans. So anytime that's updated, marketing plans must also be updated, or whenever there's significant changes in the demographics of the specific project or within the local housing market area. So there's kind of some windows of time where these plans must be reviewed and updated. Some common mistakes, not having the full and accurate information about the number of units, the pricing of the units, or they're not providing information about where the marketing was conducted. There wasn't sufficient research undertaken in terms of who would be identified as least likely to apply, which is an important first step. Not advertising in places who have been identified in that first step about who would be least likely to apply. Not following up with community contacts. Those are really critical to reach populations from trusted sources in the community. Making sure those housing opportunities, those openings, have been thoroughly advertised and have great reach into the community. Or just not having a standard to measure if your plan is effective or not. Not having that back-end measurement is definitely a challenge, because you can't show that it was effective if you're not tracking that. And then again, you can cross this one off your list because you're getting training today on fair housing laws, but that's important to have regular training as well. Just in terms of generally across the board, some housing providers offer discounts or perks. Really can depend based on what's happening in the rental housing market. Sometimes we see that occupancy starts to go a little bit lower, so discounts and perks become considered as a way to attract and fill those units. We encourage, from a fair housing perspective, of course, equal treatment here, that discounts and perks be made available regardless of any protected class, because it could be discriminatory to provide inferior terms, conditions, and privileges straight from the law there. So it would be illegal to charge higher costs for an African-American couple than a white couple, and illegal to charge families with children higher costs because of the presence of those children under the age of 18. And kind of back to our advertising, again, be mindful of all statements that are made verbally, but also recorded, messaged, posted, etc. Watch your promotional materials, watch any ads placed, whether they're in print or online, flyers, brochures, social media pages. That is all considered advertising and should have a review with your fair housing hat on. You can contact us with questions, and we hope that we'll have grant funding available to assist you. Especially for our MISHDA funded properties, we're grateful to have that funding available to you to help. We want to make sure that all staff, all residents, and all applicants are equally aware of what the criteria is that they'll be held to, what the policies are, because that helps for a successful living situation once folks have moved in, and they need to be told about any rebates or specials. So being consistent is really key to compliance. In terms of the review, I talked quite a bit about it. Do not publish or post unless you've done the review, and document that you've done it. You also want to describe the property, not the people. That's our big rule of thumb. And if you have any doubt, take it out, backspace, erase. Do not print, do not publish, do not post. It's also encouraged that you use the Equal Housing Opportunity logo. That's the little house here on the right-hand side with an equal sign inside. That is something that the federal government does want people to utilize as a tool to make sure that people are aware of and reminded that fair housing laws exist and we should have equal access to housing. I think I'll turn it back over to Bree for screening.
Sorry about that. Zoom was taking a minute to load. Thank you, Liz, for going over all that information. We have more to go.
Yes, we have one more short section before we will give you a break.
Yes. So I will now go into screening. Best practices for screening. We'll go into each of them, but establish relevant fair housing or fair screening criteria. Use only recent accurate records. Follow the screening policy. Be transparent with applicants and allow applicants to challenge negative information. So when you're establishing relevant fair screening criteria, make sure you're developing it, documenting it, and using clearly defined requirements. There should be no doubt of like what your policy is. Your leasing agents and your staff should understand what the policy is and be able to use it universally. An example would be a minimum household income from all legal ongoing sources. Focus on information tied to likelihood of compliance with obligations of tenancy. Make sure you're collecting data or information that you're using that tells you if this will be a good tenant. Don't be collecting data or information on the application if it's really not, you're not using it to help understand if this person would be a good tenant or not. That can open you up to risk if you're asking for additional information that may be connected to a protected class. Prioritize use of recent records, regularly review and document your review. And then the biggest one, and I think it's pretty consistent throughout the training, but make sure you're cross-referencing your protected class list and your policies with the protected classes and making sure and really questioning, would anyone be treated differently with this policy? When you're using recent and accurate records, this is really important because tenant screening data can be incomplete, it can be outdated, and it can just be overall incorrect. Sometimes there are people with similar names or same names, and records can be contributed to the wrong person. So make sure the records are matching multiple pieces of information. Don't use records with a positive outcome. And if it's really not clear what the outcome is, you can disregard it until you get additional information. An example of not using a record when it has a positive outcome, maybe a tenant or applicant did get an eviction filed against them, but they were able to prevail through that case. So, they weren't evicted in the end. You wouldn't use that even though the threat of eviction was there. Really be thinking and questioning, where is this data that I'm getting coming from? Am I aware of any data cleanup that is happening on the back end? If so, how often and how is it being done? Just really understanding if you're using third-party programs to do some of that screening for you or getting the data back from making sure you understand where that data is coming from and how that program works. Ensure you're following the screening criteria. Again, don't request any information outside of your policy. So if your policy is to collect only credit information and no criminal history or housing references, you should not be asking that information to somebody else. Follow the policy. Don't consider, again, records outside of the scope of the policy. Again, just make sure you're following your policy. Be transparent with applicants. Make sure your policies are written and publicly available for everyone, and everyone understands what policies they're going to be used for them to get that housing. Transparency is really important, so people do know that how they'll be screened. They can also decide if this property or this location is right for me and whether they should apply or pay the application fee. Applicants should be provided with information on how to submit mitigating circumstances. So maybe there is something part of the screening process that they need to provide additional information on for you to understand maybe what was happening around that. Maybe there is something, criminal record, and maybe it's a domestic violence situation, allowing them to have that information, a space where they can provide that information. How to submit reasonable accommodation requests, how to contest inaccurate, incomplete, or irrelevant records. As I mentioned, some records can be wrong, and if an applicant, you're getting we see this often. Applicants may have a criminal record coming back with their name, and they're like, I promise I have not ever had a criminal history, and so that should be able to, an applicant should be able to, contest that information and provide you with the accurate information. So applicants should have this information so they know how to do this on the front end. If an applicant is denied, allow them to challenge any of the negative information. So allow them the opportunity to challenge any disqualifying information or dispute any accuracy, like I just mentioned. Provide the applicant with information used in the review and what standards, specific standards were used and why they were denied. So allowing the applicant to understand why they were denied, what parts of the policy they didn't meet, so they, it helps them, continue their housing search. Applicants should also have a chance to show, even if a record is accurate, that they will comply with tenancy obligations. So it could be that, the applicant has attended a rehabilitation or financial literacy program. Maybe they've had a change in education or employment status. There's lots of, situations where a person can really show that they would be a good tenant. Maybe, in the past, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, they had an eviction, but their last rental check or their last rental reference, was like they paid on time every month. Like they had no concerns with them ever being a non-paying tenant. So allowing applicants to have that chance to provide that information. Some other factors to be considering when doing screening within credit history, credit scores. Initially were really meant to assess creditworthiness and likelihood of paying back borrowed money. They don't capture timely rent or timely utility costs or other bills and payments that are made that aren't, the traditional lender payments. Housing providers should allow for explanation or requests for reasonable accommodations, which, excuse me, I know we've mentioned that word a lot, but we will, I promise, talk about it after the break. But a reasonable accommodation is a change to the policy for a person with a disability. Some things you may be wanting to consider or questioning when you're looking at your credit history or credit score, obligations or acceptance. What information are you trying to get when you're checking the applicant's credit history? What is the credit history telling you about this person's ability to rent from you? If the question is, will the applicant pay their rent? There's other ways to get this information, an income verification. So there's other ways that you can get this information to say, oh yeah, this person will pay their rent, even though they may have a bad credit score. There are no known studies on the relationship between credit scores and successful tenancy, so that's something just keep in mind. Having no or limited credit is even less relevant than having poor credit. A lot of people don't understand the credit industry, I should say. I don't know if that's the right word, but a lot of people don't understand credit and don't understand that they may have to get a credit card to build credit. So, that education is lost for some folks. And, for myself, I didn't know that until I was 18. So just understanding that that may be not relevant for this person to say they will be a successful tenant. Admitting applicants, so long as they do not have a negative credit history, can be a more precise policy than requiring a positive credit history. Automated screening tools can be programmed to rely on other available financial information as a substitute for an absent credit score. So that's something to be considering as well. When looking at eviction history is the most common screening component within the housing industry. Eviction history is pulled from private databases from court records. However, according to the Urban Institute, they stated that there is no national requirement for courts to clean, maintain, or share data in a specific way. As a result, there is a tremendous variability and at times inaccuracies in court records. So also having that understanding of where you're getting this eviction history from, it may not be accurate. It may have not been cleaned, or there wasn't, data collected in the right way. So just understanding that back end may be helpful in creating your policies and understanding your policies. Housing providers should not rely on eviction records that are old, incomplete, irrelevant, or where a better measure of the applicant's behavior is available. Like I mentioned, do they have a positive rental history in the more recent time? Was there a change in circumstance? Distinguishing different types of evictions and varied outcomes. Eviction proceedings where the tenant prevailed, such as a settlement was reached or it was dropped, should not be considered, as I mentioned earlier. Neither should no-fault evictions, especially if the property was removed from the market. That really should not be considered, just because, again, it wasn't the tenant. It was, whatever the fault of the eviction was. Applicants should get the chance to afterward to have the record disregarded and corrections made. So also letting them know that that's on their record. Some folks may not know that a positive outcome to an eviction is still on their record, or a no-fault eviction is on their record. So allowing them to have that chance to know about it and make corrections. Another note, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, tenant screening companies must include existing disposition information for eviction records. Some questions to be considering when looking at eviction history. What do you need to know about the eviction to determine if the applicant can be a good tenant now? Is there, why or when did this happen? What were the circumstances? How long ago was it? Or what if it was long ago and the circumstances no longer apply? Again, just some things to be thinking about when creating your policies. Then moving into criminal records and criminal history. Using criminal history to inconsistently screen, deny, lease, evict, or otherwise exclude individuals of different protected classes from housing may be illegal under the Fair Housing Act. So if you're using, you have a criminal history policy, but you're not using it consistently, maybe one leasing agent uses it every time, one leasing agent, doesn't use it at all. Like that's inconsistent use of your policy, and can be maybe illegal under fair housing. Reasonable accommodations may be required, such as making an exemption to your application policy or admissions policy and disregarding certain criminal records. It could be a person's current disability might make it unlikely that they will reoffend what was previously on their record. Maybe past criminal activity was related to a mental health disability that was untreated, and now they are in treatment and they have ongoing treatment, and they have documentation to say that they have been consistent on their treatment plan, or whatever whatever the information they can provide to say, I am not a concern with my criminal record. Examples of possible discrimination: a landlord states a no felonies policy to a Black applicant but waives it for a white applicant. Again, that is a difference in treatment based on race. A landlord tells a Latina applicant with an arrest record that the apartment is already rented, but shows it available to a white applicant with an arrest record. So again, difference of treatment based on national origin. Excuse me. So best practices when it comes to your criminal history procedures: check for state or local laws that may limit your ability to run a criminal background check. Liz talked about earlier, there's different, fair chance acts coming into place, and making sure you understand if that's something within your community. Check for any available or applicable program requirements, regulations, or restrictions. So you do have to adhere by those if there is anything under a program that you're participating in. Consider not using criminal history to screen tenants for housing. Avoid third-party screening companies that use biased algorithms. Delay considering criminal history until after verifying financial and other qualifications. So making sure the person can qualify financially, or and what other your other qualifications for tenancy, and then you can consider criminal history after you've verified the other information. Treat comparable criminal history similarly. Before denying an applicant or evicting a resident, provide them the criminal record and give them the opportunity to correct wrong information or explain extenuating circumstances. Only evict for criminal activity as a last resort and after an individualized assessment. So an individualized assessment is, just getting that information of what the circumstances were in this situation. When looking at policies, best practices for criminal history, consider the nature, severity, and recency of the criminal conduct. Again, you're really trying to understand if this person is going to be a danger to your community, your neighbors, your other tenants, or the property itself. So with that being said, make sure you're accurately distinguishing between criminal conduct that indicates a demonstrable risk to resident safety and or property. Is it a difference between a homicide or arson versus a gambling or cyber crimes or tax crimes or prostitution? Those are very different types of crimes, and one affects the residents and the property, and one is just a bad decision. Avoid automatic denials, blanket bans, i.e., no felonies, and consideration of arrests. Provide for an individualized assessment of relevant mitigating information. So again, allowing that people to provide additional information around their criminal history. When looking at criminal history, when it comes to a PHA or public housing authority, PHAs and project owners must deny admission to anyone who within the last 3 years have been evicted from federal housing for drug-related criminal activity, unless there's been drug rehabilitation or circumstances leading to the eviction no longer exists. So even within the PHA world, you still have to get that information to see, is this circumstance even, around the situation. Current users, so they must deny admission to current users of illegal drugs, abusers of alcohol, or pattern interfering with the health, safety, and peaceful enjoyment of property. Anyone who has been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine on federally assisted property, anyone subject to a lifetime sex offender list, or anyone with a history of alcohol abuse that is a responsible entity reasonable believes threatens in the health, safety, or right in the peaceful enjoyment of property. So if somebody has a history of alcohol abuse and it's been disruptive or has been harmful to others, is how I understand that. For LIHTC properties, low-income housing tax credit. So this is why at the beginning, Liz asked, or when Liz was presenting, why she asked if you knew if your property had federal funding. So these are some things that apply to those folks. So it's important that you understand if these things apply to you and understand where your funding is coming from. So regarding criminal history for LIHTC, there's a compliance manual that you can find here at this link, and you can look at this handbook as well. The handbook outlines criminal background screening criteria And the following language appears: owners must establish written screening criteria to prohibit the admission of certain individuals who have engaged in drug-related criminal behavior or are subject to state lifetime sex offender registration, or are individuals who abuse or pattern of abuse of alcohol interferes with this health, safety, and peaceful environments. So owners may choose to expand these circumstances, but they aren't required to. So those are the only ones that they have to abide by. So before we get to our break, as I know all of you are probably anxiously waiting, we have a couple polls that we kind of just want to test your knowledge based on what we talked about today. And my polls aren't showing up. Sorry, one moment. Oh, there we go. So for this first one, which of these policies and practices have the lowest fair housing risk? Provide applicants with information on how to dispute inaccurate, incomplete, and/or irrelevant records. Develop and document clear policies that are transparent to applicants. Regularly review screening and application criteria. Allow leasing agents to decide when to request or require certain information. In your criminal background policy, consider the nature, severity, and recency of criminal conduct. So we want to look at, we want to be selecting the policies and practices that have the lowest fair housing risk. So having these policies, has very low risk in our eyes. People are really quick to this one, but I do want to give a couple 30 seconds to maybe a minute to let people answer this one. Give folks about another 30 seconds here. I see the answers coming in, so when they slow down, I will most likely end the poll. Okay, get your last second answers in. Okay. End the poll and share the results. So this is a new poll for us. So if you guys have attended in the past, this was a new one. So of these policies and practices, which ones have the lowest fair housing risk? It's going to be provide applicants with information on how to dispute, develop clear policies, regularly review the criteria, and then consider in your criminal background, consider the nature, severity, and recency. So the incorrect one is the allowing leasing agents to decide when to request or require certain information. That has really, really high fair housing risk when you allow leasing agents to decide that information. So good job, everyone. I'm going to move to the next one here. I'll go ahead and launch it so you can start thinking about it. Which of the following groups must comply with fair housing? Property owners, condo association board members, contracted staff, landscaping, pest control, etc., managers, maintenance team, residents, and none of the above. Please select all that makes sense, multiple choice. I'll give folks about 10 more seconds here to get in your answers, and then we'll review them, and then we have one more before the break. All right. Good job, everyone. Which of the groups must comply with fair housing? It is all of the groups listed. Property owners, condo board members, contracted staff, because they're representing your company while they are there on your property. Managers, maintenance team, and even residents must comply with fair housing. And then the last one here, based on National and Fair Housing Center West Michigan data, what protected class has the highest allegations? Give folks about 30 seconds. Ten more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. Share results. Um, this is very interesting because we covered it. So I don't know if folks missed that part, but based on the data that we shared earlier, disability is the allegation or is the protected class that has the highest allegations. So disability has been our number one allegation for over a decade. And I'm not sure about the national data, but the national data is pretty similar, I would say. So disability tends to be the highest allegation, followed by race. So people that did say race, you are, that is the second one. So you're not incorrect. But with that being said, we are now going to go into our break. We are going to give a 10-minute break. So please return back here at 1:57 or yeah, 1:57.
Actually, I think my clock says 2:36, Bree, so I think we want to come back at 2:40, 2:46, please.
Sorry about that. Yes,
That might be a little bit too long of a break.
Yes, sorry about that, everyone. I was looking at
2:46, please. Yeah.
how long we've been on this training. So
Yeah.
yes, 2:46. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, this is a warning for everyone that we will begin resuming here in just a moment. So if you could get back to your computers or your seats if you're sitting in a group, we're going to get started here. And please don't forget to put any questions in the Q&A. Please do not put questions in the chat as they will be missed because there's a lot of activity happening in the chat. So please put them in the Q&A. It's also easiest for us to answer them. So please, if you have questions, please put them in there. And then I will go ahead, excuse me, and get started. Excuse me. Okay, we're going to go over the protected classes now. We're going to do a breakdown of the protected classes and talk about potential discrimination. So with race, color, and national origin, race refers to people distinguished by socially significant perceived physical characteristics, hair texture, skin color, eye shape, other differences. Color refers to a person's skin color. So as people may know or may not know, just because you're one race doesn't mean your skin color matches that race. So we see difference of treatment based on skin color of people of the same race. So that's why color is called out. National origin refers to one's country of origin or an individual's birth or where their ancestors are from. This could be birthplace, ethnicity, culture, accent, spoken language, appearance with that specific nationality. And then additionally, with the protections, and it's really kind of across all of the protections, perception of someone's race, color, national origin, the perception of somebody's protected class is also protected. So if somebody is denied because they think they're something and they're not, and they're denied because of that reason, that's still illegal under discrimination, even if it's incorrect. Some examples of possible discrimination: a landlord only renting to a light-skinned African American, but not those who are dark-skinned. Neighbors or housing providers harassing tenants, such as using racial slurs or making offensive and threatening statements, especially if a housing provider knows about a neighbor harassing tenants based on a protected class and is not taking action on that. That can be, the housing provider can be held liable for that. Steering darker skin applicants to units at the back of an apartment complex, misrepresenting the availability of an apartment because of the race of the applicants, in this instance, Asian American, treating residents differently because of their race of their guests, and then we talked about the no felonies difference of treatment. Then looking at sex and gender, no preference on the basis of sex should be stated. Gender preference language can be only used in advertising for roommates or for people who are have shared living spaces, communal spaces. So it's the only time gender preference languages can be used in advertising is when it's that roommate for shared spaces. Some examples: refusing to rent to a female tenant because the lease requires taking care of the yard and snow removal. So an assumption that maybe a female tenant cannot take care of those things. And in some instances, treating someone differently because of their survivor of domestic violence could be sex discrimination. Sexual harassment by a housing provider or administrator is also considered discrimination under sex protections. A housing provider evicts a female victim of domestic violence, but not the male perpetrator. So again, it's a difference of treatment based on that protected class. Now we're going to dive into disability status, and this one's a little bit longer of a section. And it's our most questioned section, so please again put them in the chat. Disability status is broadly defined, and it covers both mental and physical disabilities. The definition includes a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity, and we'll talk about what a major life activity is here in a second. A record of having such impairment or being regarded as having such impairment. So again, if a person is being discriminated against because somebody thinks they have a disability and they don't, that's still considered protected. A major life activity should be broadly construed and include physical, mental, and social activities. So this could be sleeping, walking, breathing, bathing, driving, hearing, seeing. It's a very broad definition to really have a more encapsulating idea of what disabilities are. On the instance of the assuming somebody's somebody's something and not. We had a case or this was a case, I'm not sure if it was our case, but there was a case once where a gentleman who was a veteran was going in to apply somewhere and he had a physical disability. Him and the leasing agent began talking, and he just was sharing his story and his experiences overseas. And he shared, how he got his injury and, the time he spent in the hospital and things like that. And it was a very kind conversation. And then he ended up being denied from that housing opportunity because the leasing agent was afraid that he would develop PTSD or he had PTSD, and she wasn't sure how to interact with him or how to, handle him. And so, that is still protected under fair housing. He wasn't a person with PTSD, but he was denied because of that reason, and that's considered a disability. The person made a assumption based on the knowledge they have of people, veterans, and things like that, but that wasn't his case. Liz kind of talked about this briefly, but you can talk about the behavior, so no smoking, but you can't talk about the person. So you can say no smoking, you can't say no smokers, or no drinking rather than no drinkers, especially because alcoholism and drug addictions are considered disabilities under the Fair Housing Law, but current drinking and drug use is not protected. But people with past history, it's considered a disability. So, saying no drinkers has fair housing risk. More examples: a leasing agent refusing to show units to someone in a wheelchair, saying it wouldn't be a good fit. So making an assumption that somebody would want a unit based on how you perceive them or how you perceive their abilities, you're taking away housing choice. So with anything we're talking about today, if you're taking away someone's housing choice based on a protected class, then that is housing discrimination. So, not offering somebody to a 2-floor unit because they're in a wheelchair, you're not giving all the options. It's up to the person who is renting what space works best for them. Refusal to assign a designated accessible parking space as a reasonable accommodation to a first come, first served parking policy. If a person with a disability needs a designated accessible parking space, they can request that. The standard blue, public handicap parking that we have, that's also first come, first serve for people with handicap placards. However, a person at a housing unit may not, they may not be able to get that because everyone's using it. So be able to having that individualized parking space, would really help a person with a disability. There's been many cases I've heard where people have not left their homes because they got that accessible parking space, but they don't want to leave to lose it. So that's still, there's an issue there. Refusal to permit reasonable modifications such as wheelchair ramps or grab bars. Asking applicants for a medical history to prove that they have a disability or to prove that they can live independently. So reasonable accommodation. So a reasonable accommodation is a change in policy, rule, or procedure or service in order for a person with a disability to have equal access and enjoyment of their housing. And then linked here is a joint statement that kind of talks about reasonable accommodations. It's really, really great document to kind of look through some frequently asked questions and examples and things like that. So we highly recommend reviewing that when you have possible questions on reasonable accommodations. Some examples: waiving a no pet policy for a person with a disability when they have an assistance animal. Maybe transferring to a different floor or unit because they can no longer get to that. Maybe they no longer can walk up the stairs, and so they need a first floor unit. So asking for a transfer would be a reasonable accommodation. Accepting rent based on the arrival of disability income. Disability income comes when it comes on a certain set date, and a person can't change that. So if a disability income comes on the 7th, but rent is due on the 1st, and then you start accruing late fees, a person with a disability can ask for a reasonable accommodation to change their rental due date to be the 7th when they receive their income, and then so on, the late fee, schedule would still fit. It's just that that initial date, what is it? And then your normal policy then proceeds. Generally, reasonable accommodations are the responsible of the housing provider because they are your rules, your policies. And in order for a person to have that equal access and enjoyment, they need you to change that for them. When you're processing reasonable accommodations, be thinking about what does your current existing policy say? What is the standard procedure and service, and how does this request differ? What documentation do you need? It's really dependent on if they have a visible disability and disability-related need. So that's something you have to assess, or if you already know about somebody's disability, which we'll talk about a little bit. When or how does the policy and service get changed? All of these questions require homework, and that's something that we can help talk you through in the end. And you're welcome if you're within our service area and we have the grant funding to do so, we can help you. Something to just call out, under the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, under Section 504, it states that structural changes needed by a person with a disability within housing that receives federal financial assistance, those are considered reasonable accommodations. So we'll talk about structural changes as being modifications, but under this 1973 Rehabilitation Act, if you receive federal funding, so again, that's why we asked that question. If you receive federal funding, structural changes are considered reasonable accommodations, and they must be paid for by the housing provider unless providing them would be an undue financial administrative burden or a fundamental alteration of the program, or unless the housing provider can accommodate the individual's needs through other means. However, a person with a disability has the most knowledge of what they need and what works best for them. So often letting that guide the conversation when somebody asks for something for their disability. So a reasonable modification is that structural change, that physical change to a unit or housing to provide a person with a disability physical access. So common ones we think of are ramps or grab bars in the bathroom, changing the doorknob from a knob to a lever, adjusting the heights of outlets, altering a walkway, altering an entrance to a unit. These are all, again, changes to the physical structure. This must be allowed for the most part when reasonable. Housing providers may require that the tenant get necessary permits and things, and then that the work be done in a workmanlike manner. As with the reasonable modifications, there is another joint statement that provides additional information. So there's two different ones, one's for accommodations and one's for modifications. Both are really great documents to utilize. When processing reasonable modifications, be thinking about who's going to be using it. Is it for the sole use of this tenant, or will everybody in the complex use it? Will there be any issues regarding code compliance? Do you need documentation? Do you need plans and drawings? The big one that we often get, who pays? We're going to ask how is your property funded? And that determines on what laws apply. Generally, private housing, the tenant pays. Federally funded housing, the housing provider pays. What happens when the tenant moves out? Be thinking about that. If that's something you want to keep with your unit because it's a great accommodation or a great just amenity to have and to have on your unit, maybe then you will pay for it because you're going to use it. You're going to let other folks use it after the tenant moves out. I'll require homework again, and we do have a guidebook with a sample response form that is linked, and it was also provided in the handouts as well. For both accommodations and modifications, tenants can request them at any time, any part of the lease, because our abilities change over time. It's not concrete. Tenants with unobservable disabilities or disability-based needs can be asked for documentation on why they may need what they're asking for. Tenants can request more than one accommodation or modification. Again, a person with a disability knows what they need best, and so letting that guide the conversation of what they need. Request must not create unreasonable burden on the housing provider, such as not getting paid rent. Another one we've used an example for is somebody can't drive because of a disability and asks you to drive them places. Well, that requires you to get a bus, hire staff, additional things that you don't have capacity for, wasn't, your normal business. These are all things, again, we can help you understand and talk through, and we have some documents there, resources there as well. I'm looking at a good example here. This is a good example. We have clear lines, clear markings. There's a nice edge. That is a good example. And here is a bad example. And this was actually used as evidence in court to say they did provide an accessible route. They just stuck a placard on stairs, which is clearly not accessible at all. The judge did not like that, as from what I understand. It feels like a really bad joke that doesn't really land, unfortunately. With assistance animals, individuals with disabilities may request a reasonable accommodation for assistance animals. This can include emotional support animals. There are situations when, both Section 504 and the Fair Housing apply. And, we talked about what those situations are. Species other than dogs with or without training, animals that provide emotional support have been recognized as assistance animals under reasonable accommodation provision. So assistance animals is really the blanket term for the various types of animals underneath the umbrella. So assistance animals, the umbrella, and then you have support animals and then service animals. Service animals are trained animals, and then support animals can be trained or untrained. Under the Fair Housing Act and Section 504, individuals with a disability may be entitled to keep an assistance animal as a reasonable accommodation that otherwise would impose restrictions or prohibition on the animal. In order to qualify for such an accommodation, the assistance animal must be necessary to afford the individual an equal opportunity to use and enjoy or participate in a housing service or program. There also must be a relationship or nexus between the person's disability and the assistance the animal provides. So it's not just the presence of the disability, it's what is the relationship? What is the need for this assistance animal for this person's disability? What's the connection? If these requirements are met, a housing facility program service must allow the assistance animal as an accommodation unless they can demonstrate that the assistance animal would impose an undue financial or administrative burden or alter the nature and services of the program. Also, with assistance animals, they could be denied if the specific animal in question poses a direct threat to the health, safety, and others and cannot be reduced or eliminated by a reasonable accommodation or if the specific animal would cause substantial damage to the property or others. And it cannot be reduced or eliminated as well. So if it's a direct threat, maybe it is the dog, barks or growls or lunges, maybe not lunge, but they use their mouth in some way. Maybe it's a muzzle. You ask the person to get a muzzle, and then the direct threat is now reduced. So there has to be that kind of that interactive process of ensuring that this person could still have this thing if there was other things they could do to reduce that threat. Assistant animal best practices. Assistance animals, including service dogs and emotional support animals, are allowed in housing. Any animal can be requested. Unique animals, maybe like a monkey, that might require more documentation to say this specific animal does this specific thing. It's like a monkey. They have dexterity. So maybe it's helping you open your medicine bottles. Excuse me. So that needs additional documentation to really say, okay, this person can have a monkey because it does this thing that nothing else can do. There is no limit on how many assistance animals a person with a disability can have, although multiple animals may need to be substantiated. So animal A does this, where animal B does this. So you really have to show what is the need for multiple assistance animals, or a person needs to show the need. Owners of an assistance animal must also ensure that their animal is under control, cleaned up after, and if they can't do so, that they make arrangements to do so. So if they are a person with a disability that cannot clean up after their animal, they still have to make arrangements of how that's going to be cleaned. The animal's going to be cleaned up after. Housing providers cannot require training or specific certificates for assistance animals. Again, service animals are those trained animals. Those are the ones that are allowed in public spaces, on airplanes, things like that. Emotional support animals do not, and they don't require training. So you cannot ask for assistance animals to have specific certificates or training. Can't require the use of a specific form to request assistance animals. That documentation should be able to be provided, however the way the person wants to provide it. We always recommend have it being written down so there's no confusion. Apply pet policies. House providers cannot apply pet policies to assistance animals, including charging pet fees. That is very clear that people with disabilities should not be charged fees on the front end because of the things they need for their disability. So we recommend having a different policy for assistance animals. So you can, if you allow pets, you can have your pet policy and allow those policies to go towards pets. Those aren't protected. But assistance animals should have a different policy to really differentiate between the two. We've also included that in the handouts, I believe, a sample one. So again, charging in the front end fees or surcharges for assistance animal is a no. If you take a security deposit and on the back end you assess, you're assessing the normal way you would, and there is damage from an animal, you can still charge that, take that from the security deposit. It just has to follow your normal process in that end. You can't have a specific policy then created because you're going to look at security deposits for only assistance animals. That would again be a difference of treatment. You cannot place restrictions on the breed, size, or weight of an assistance animal. When looking at supporting documentation, a housing provider is entitled to obtain information that is necessary to evaluate whether a reasonable accommodation or modification is necessary because of a disability, but only when the disability is not obvious or known. So thinking about what do you know? Do you know this person receives disability? Maybe they've requested a different accommodation or modification. So be thinking about what you already know about this person and the information they've already given you. Maybe on application day, they provided you with their whole life story, and you just note that down that they shared that with you. So you know that now. You can also get documentation if the disability-related need is not readily apparent or otherwise known to you. Some, disabilities are invisible, and so we don't know what, the need is there. What is, the disability is not obvious, and then the need wouldn't be apparent either if you don't know what the disability is. So just be thinking about that. What information do you already have? If a disability is not obvious, what kinds of information can a housing provider request? Thinking about what do we still need to know? What information do you need? Generally, you would need confirmation that the person has, 1, a disability defined by law, and 2, a disability-related need. And there is a nexus between them. There is a connection. It's not just saying Bree has anxiety, and so she needs to pay rent late. Like there's no nexus there. Maybe there could be, depending on somebody else's disability, but you really have to show what the connection is. Processing requests, the approval or denial of request depends on the circumstances given to you and the needs, and it all needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So not every wheelchair request is going to look the same. Not every ESA request is going to look the same. And it's just knowing, what information you have and, what information you need. Again, all case by case. So you do need to document every step taken, what information you were given, what information you have. And just remember also this information needs to be confidential as well. Again, people with disabilities have the most accurate knowledge about their limitations, so it's often great to listen to them. Within reasonableness, so as I mentioned, you can deny a disability if it is an undue financial burden or it's just unreasonable. So what does that mean? Again, it's an undue financial or administrative burden on the provider. Is there an accommodation that would fundamentally alter the nature of their operations? If the original request is found to be unreasonable, what are alternatives? What other things can you do that would meet their needs? Again, this is why we say case by case. This is why we use the words interactive process, because once a person with a disability asks for something, it is a continuing conversation of what can be done, what can't be done, what, you're working together on figuring out what can be, in the end, what would work for this person to stay in this housing. But if you are denying something, you must offer an alternative. And we have a response form that was also included that kind of has that kind of guides you through that to make sure you're marking every box there. So we have a poll here to test your knowledge on what we've talked about. So in this situation, what should you do? A person with a heart condition requests a reserved parking spot due to not being able to walk long distances. Do you request documentation from a healthcare provider? Tell them they can use the existing handicap spot outside the unit. Have them pay for the materials to put up a sign for the reserved spot, and meet with them to discuss the request. Give folks about 30 seconds here. All right, get your answers in. Okay. I'm going to share the results. So a person with a heart condition requests a reserved parking spot due to not being able to walk long distances. Well, what do we know? I think in this instance, you could request documentation from a healthcare provider to, say that they're a person with a disability and they have a disability-related need for this. And then the next answer with this would be to meet with them to discuss the request. So just meeting with them to understand exactly what they need, just the details of the request. It would be inappropriate to tell them to use the existing handicap spot outside the unit because, as I mentioned, they requested a reserved parking spot because they need that spot. And, again, those spots that are outside are free to anybody with a handicap placard. So they are wanting their specific spot. And then, again, as I mentioned, with assistance animals, but it's across the board, people with disabilities should not be paying for paying fees or things. So technically, a reserved parking spot is considered a reasonable accommodation because it's a change to your policy. Your policy is a free-for-all parking. So it's a change to the policy. So yes, there are materials required to put up a sign and whatnot, but that cost would not come to the tenant. So ask for documentation and meet with them to talk about it. And then I have another one here. What documentation is needed? So you have a senior housing applicant using a motorized scooter. They requested permission to use different hinges on her front door to increase the space to enter her apartment. This is single choice. Does she need information to does she need to provide information on her disability? Does she need to provide information on her disability-related need? Does she need to provide information on her disability and disability-related need? Or she doesn't need to provide information on either her disability or her disability-related need, or you're not sure, which is a reasonable answer. Give folks about 30 to 45 seconds. Okie dokie. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results there. So this really depends. That I know is not the greatest answer all the time, but it depends on what you know, what the door is like. But overall, that she uses a motorized scooter, so you don't need and provide information on her disability or proof on her disability. The disability related need would be, that I agree with the 28% of you. She needs to provide proof on her disability related need because it needs to be more specific. What type of hinges? How much more space does she need? So there's a little bit more information there that you may need. So providing that getting documentation to say what is the specific disability related need here. But it does depend. It depends on what you know, and things like that. So that was a little gray area one. All right, so now I'm going to move into familial status and marital status. Familial status is, referring to anyone, whether or not an individual has minor children or under the age of 18 living with them. So again, children in the home under age of 18, that is familial status. So people without kids are not protected. People with kids are protected. So that's a key thing to be thinking about when you're thinking about your policies. A family, again, it's a very broad definition. So it can include a single parent. It can be somebody that's pregnant. It could be people that are in the process of adopting or securing legal custody, people having foster children. It could be grandparents raising grandchildren, siblings raising siblings, just anybody that is in anytime there's children in the home under 18, that home would be protected under familial status. Some examples: having a policy that residents cannot have more than 2 children in the household. That would be familial status discrimination. Refusal to rent to sell to anyone because of children or being pregnant. Allowing families to access recreational facilities or having different rules for different children, charging extra fees, and restricting families to certain floors or areas of a complex. Sometimes we see familial status discrimination being, you as a landlord are just looking out for that family. You don't want them on the second floor because you don't want their kids to fall down the stairs because they have an infant, or they have a balcony and you don't want anyone to get hurt on the balcony. That can be out of the kindness of your heart, but you're again removing that choice from that family. That is up to the family what housing fits them best. With marital status, it's whether or not somebody is married, widowed, singled, or divorced. A person's marital status can never be used on the basis of discrimination. Charging more rent for couples who are not married, requiring higher rent or down payment for a single woman, not letting people add a partner to their lease because they're not married. Requiring a couple to be married before moving in together. That was actually a case. It was a senior living facility, and 2 90-year-old older adults met there, and they wanted to move in together, but the senior housing complex wouldn't let them because they were not married. And at the time, that wasn't the decision they wanted to make. But that was discrimination on the basis of marital status. Suggesting people move based on a change in their marital status. Looking at occupancy, the Fair Housing Act allows housing providers to adhere to local, state, and federal restrictions when it comes to occupancy. So you want to look at local, state, and federal policies and rules on occupancy. This may include property maintenance codes, zoning codes, minimum floor codes, requirements, things along that. But often it's considered the number of people and the size of the room and the overall size and configuration of the unit. So it's based on size, really, for occupancy. Best practices must comply with all applicable laws in regarding to the number of people. However, policy should not be more restrictive than the applicable laws. So if a law is saying, or requirement is saying, whatever it is, and you say, oh, no, I'm going to say 2 less than that is being more restrictive. We do have some resources on how to determine that occupancy limits that are linked there, as well as the guidebook, I believe, is in the handouts. However, it is linked here. Although a housing provider may reasonably limit occupancy based on local health and safety codes, it's best to keep those limits out of advertising, because it's opening you up to fair housing risk when you are having that in advertising. And sometimes it's difficult to verify that occupancy limit is reasonable and therefore legal. So it could just open up a can of worms that you don't want to get into. Best to state the property size. So it's a 2-bedroom apartment. It's a 3-bedroom single family home. Talk about the number of units. Again, talk about the units. not the people. With familial status and marital status, offering different rates based on the number of people to occupy may also violate fair housing laws. Examples of this is we've seen charging $1,000 per month for 2 people, but $50 a month for each additional person. This has harm on people with families. So that would be, that puts you up for fair housing risk. Are you doing that because you don't want families to live there? There's more information that can, kind of say like, that's risky. Indicating people without kids get a preferential price or there are penalties for getting married. Now I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who will be, I believe so, talking about religion. No, I'm still talking. Sorry. I'm going to finish up religion and then pass it over to Liz. Discrimination in housing on the basis of religion is prohibited under local, state, and federal fair housing laws, so across the whole board. Protects against religious discrimination, whether one is a member of a particular religion or none at all. There is a narrow exemption for religious organizations that are limiting the sale, rental, or occupancy to members of their own religion, as long as the housing is not operated for commercial purposes or use. So good examples are convents, that's only for those folks, and it's not open to, you can't just go rent it. So again, it can't be operated for commercial use. That's the only exemption for religious organizations. If you are advertising for housing, it should include statements that this home does not discriminate on the basis of religion, color, race, national origin, sex, marital status. This can be really useful, especially if your branding may have religious ties to it. It's important to make sure you're stating that you do not discriminate based on the list of protected classes. As long as symbols and/or terms relating to religious holidays are secularized, they will not automatically constitute a violation of fair housing laws. However, it is to use with risk because it could invite a claim. Somebody may not feel that it's inviting to their religion. So it's just everything if you do use those, just use it with caution. Sorry. Statements using the legal name of established that can original reference religious symbol may violate the law unless it includes that disclaimer that I mentioned earlier. So it is risky, but having that disclaimer takes away some of that risk. It is permissible to describe the services or facilities. So if there is a complex with a chapel or a senior housing development with kosher meals, that is something that you can say, as a bonus. Like we have this here. Some examples, prohibiting use of community spaces within a complex for religious purposes, even if they're permitted to be used for secular gatherings. A big one, asking about an applicant's religion. That would be definitely high up there on possible discrimination. Advertising that a home is located near a particular place of worship, so you're not including all places of worship or surrounding you. Allowing certain religious decorations, but not for others. So you allow angels, but you won't allow a menorah. So you're allowing one thing, but not the other. Making negative comments about somebody's religion or having harassment happening based on religious accessories, garments, or coverings. And then running ads in only one religious publication could also open you up to risk. Now I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who will talk to us about age protections.
Thank you, Bree. I was hopefully doing my best to keep up with the Q&A. I really appreciate the questions. I think there is one comment left in there that I'm not sure if we need to address. So if you do have a question, please feel free to log back in and let us know what your question is to expand upon the Section 8 project-based rental assistant housing referred there. So. But love the questions, and we're doing our best to keep up. Keep in mind you have our contact information, and we will do our best to be helpful to you or get you to the right source or local fair housing center. As Bree mentioned, we have age protections across the state. We often see this added at the local level as well. It's biological age. Essentially in Michigan, as long as someone can legally enter into a contract, Age should not be used as a basis for discrimination in housing, with the exception of our senior housing properties, which we have mentioned a couple times. Senior housing is exempt from age and familial status protections if they are in compliance with the Housing for Older Adults, or HOPA, laws. So someone who is a minor under the age of 18 in Michigan is emancipated automatically in the following circumstances: if they are legally married, once they turn 18, they are emancipated as an adult while they're on active duty in the armed forces of the United States, or if they have been validly emancipated under the laws of another state. These are all individuals under the age of 18 who can be treated legally as an adult and therefore sign a rental lease and other contracts. So if that is the case with an application that you receive, if they are 17 and married, you can establish proof that they are legally married so that you can make sure that you can enter into a contract lease with them and hold them to it. Condominium associations are areas where we do see limits and age restrictions that are often not in compliance with fair housing laws. Generally, HOAs, the homeowners associations or condo associations, are groups that aren't housing professionals, aren't often trained, and aren't required to be trained. So we do see things where folks are limited by age, and sometimes even apartment communities steering certain age groups or families with younger children to an under 14 building. That was the case we had along the lakeshore years ago, which was then followed by not only the illegal age-based steering, but also then less quality maintenance in that particular building. The other buildings were held to a better maintenance standard and fully repaired. The under 14 building received kind of Band-Aid repairs. And so that was certainly problematic here in Michigan. It's a violation to refuse to rent to someone because they are over or under a certain age. An arbitrary age like 40 years old would not be legal here in Michigan. Sometimes we see advertisements that tend to indicate a preference for one age group over another, and a preference maybe for younger people. If it's a dynamic community for young adults, that could leave out other folks who are looking for a dynamic community who aren't considered a young adult. We also see older applicants sometimes steered to less desirable units or buildings, maybe putting older adults on the back of a property, for example, to illustrate that this is not housing for people who aren't independent or active. Sometimes we see more restrictive income, credit, or rental history requirements for younger people. That can happen for older adults as well. That heightened scrutiny, any change from the normal practice based on age has fair housing risk for violating state law. And certainly then advertising adults only or active senior community language, it would be something we would discourage as well. So I've mentioned HOPA several times, and so here's the link to the law, and these are the criteria that a property needs to meet. They're pretty basic, essentially that it's housing or a dwelling specifically designed for and occupied by elderly persons under federal, state, or local government programs, or they are 100% already occupied by 62 and older residents. You can't discriminate to get to that 100%. But if that's the existing standard when the housing is opened, that would be exempt. And then there's a younger limit, the 55 and older limit, that has more flexibility but can create a little more confusion, because what happens is it's allowable for having one person in at least 80% of the units who is 55 and older. So other residents within the households can be different ages. And sometimes properties do, go up to 100% of the units have somebody 55 and older. But this was kind of allowed for that flexibility. As we all age, it happens every year. We add another digit so that, there's kind of an acknowledgement that there's some flexibility that might be needed to inherit property as households blend or age in place. We have a fantastic guide. I've shared the link in the Q&A for fair housing for senior housing providers. It's originally specific to Kent County, but these are federal protections and state protections. So a lot of the information is going to still be very helpful, and I encourage you to check it out as well. Senior housing providers must also do age verification. Similarly with students, there are very limited protections for student status in West Michigan. Now, the rest of you across the state, I am aware of other cities, Ann Arbor, East Lansing, for example, may have student status. Here in West Michigan, Holland, the city of Holland has education status as a protection, and that's really the only reference that we have that would be very similar. So it's important to check your local laws and make sure you know what they are. If it's not a protected class, it doesn't violate fair housing laws to give a preference or impose a limit as to students. But again, it would have to be consistently applied to all students, regardless of age. You can't just pick 18 to 22-year-old traditional student ages and target that group. That would violate age protections. So generally, again, best to avoid any sort of age unless you're legally exempt under the HOPA. So sometimes we see discounts or specific prohibitions against students, and that all has to be done with full fair housing homework and verification of laws that might apply before anything is undertaken there. So we'll get into sexual orientation and gender identities, which are fairly new here in the state of Michigan. They went into effect in, well, I guess 2 years ago last month, I suppose. Time does fly. Michigan's Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act was expanded. However, we had 45 to 50 local communities that had some sort of protection for sexual orientation and gender identity existing. So this is now statewide, regardless of how housing is funded. People cannot be discriminated against because of their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, which we will explain. There are legal definitions for all of the protected classes, so we want to make sure that we're clear, and I did add some information in the Q&A as well. Sexual orientation is really about who you're attracted to. So we have orientations that include heterosexual or straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual, and others. So again, about who you're attracted to and want to have a relationship with. We have the legal definition listed there as well, and again, it includes that history or perception piece. And then for gender identity or orientation, this is internal knowledge about their own gender. It is different from sexual orientation. Examples would be man, woman, non-binary, and others. The legal definition is there. And again, it includes having or being perceived as having a gender-related self-identity or expression, whether that's associated with someone's assigned sex at birth or not. The gender expression element is the external manifestation of gender expressed through someone's name, pronouns, clothing, haircut, voice, and/or behavior, and other characteristics. Possible examples of discrimination would be a manager at a 55 plus community rejecting a male tenant's request to add his same-sex partner to his lease, stating in writing that the community only accepts married couples and unions between one man and one woman. That would be a violation. Another one would be a maintenance worker who is employed by a housing provider who is subjecting a female tenant to pervasive harassment because she is a lesbian. This was based on a case, and actually additional discrimination did occur when the tenant rightfully reported the harassment she was experiencing to the management, who did not take any actions to stop it. So we have two staff persons then who are violating the law. Our source of income protections are also relatively new. We are going to celebrate the anniversary here next month. Just to kind of level set and make sure everybody understands, we use the terminology source of income all the time. We abbreviate it to SOI, but we want to slow down and make sure everyone understands that source of income refers to where one's income comes from. Again, as I mentioned earlier, housing providers can and usually do consider a tenant's income, looking at their ability to pay rent and the other financial obligations that would be tied to the lease. These protections prohibit housing providers from specifying or limiting the sources of income that they accept. A lot of the work done around these pieces of legislation came from networks serving people who are unhoused and cost-burdened families, who are defined as people who have to spend 30% more of their monthly income on rent and utilities. And also we know there's a large number of families experiencing severe cost burden, which is spending over half of the money you have every month on rent or utilities in order to stay housed. There's other layers of protection. So properties that are financed with low-income housing tax credit, often called LIHTC dollars, are required to accept vouchers. I talked about our new state law. I just want to note that Michigan's Landlord Tenant Act was amended at the same time because the language is reflected and refers back and forth between those two laws. And so they now match, which is important for clarity. And then many communities have local source of income protections and have had them for a long time, like Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming. So I mentioned the laws went into effect April of 2025. We've talked about the definition. Again, just a reminder, it's really protecting income that includes benefits or subsidy programs that contribute to household income. So it could be a housing choice or Section 8 voucher, Social Security, supplemental security income, retirement income, any other benefit program that is contributing towards housing and public assistance. Under local laws, we have to remember there's another layer there. The definitions might be broader and include child support or alimony, and there may be no exemptions at the local level. So we're always happy to help you understand which laws apply based on your geography. That's why it's so important to get to know those protected classes, as I mentioned. And then again, LIHTC properties are required to accept vouchers as a source of income. They are not allowed to discriminate against voucher holders. The owners are required to certify every year that they are adhering to that requirement. And state housing agencies are responsible for monitoring the LIHTC properties for this compliance. So a little more alphabet soup and lingo, just want to make sure I'm clear. The Housing Choice Voucher or HCV rental assistance, that's used to be known as Section 8. Many people still use that terminology, but current language really is going to reflect HCV rental assistance. It's funded by the federal government and is administered by local public housing authorities. These are your housing commissions or housing council. To help households with low income pay their rent. A tenant with a housing choice voucher pays a fixed portion of the rent, and the program pays the remainder of the rent directly to the landlord. Some programs cover the entirety of the rent. Another program is the VASH program. It's a type of housing choice voucher that aids veterans specifically who are experiencing homelessness in their families. It comes with case management and clinical services provided by the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs. So going back to the state level protections, again, our newer laws, housing providers are allowed to require a certain base amount of income to rent a unit, but again, can't limit where that money comes from. The sources of the money must be legal and ongoing. It does not include income derived in any sort of illegal manner. Again, we've asked for kind of clarification and we're hoping to kind of provide updated guidance as we receive it, but we have questions about what does it mean to be ongoing? Is there kind of a time threshold we can look at and refer to that was not included or specified in the legislation? So that is something that could be addressed by case law as it develops over time. Housing agencies that are working with vouchers must move quickly within 30 days once all the paperwork is completed to keep that process moving forward. Some exemptions, which may not exist at the local level, but at this state protection level, exemptions are provided for small landlords that have fewer than 5 units in the state. So it's specific in the Tenant Landlord Act that a landlord or a person with fewer than 5 rental units in Michigan is exempt, but they broadly define who that would apply to. Person means individual, partnership, corporation, association, limited liability company, or any other legal entity. They're going to look at that individual's entire portfolio of housing available for rent. The related entity languages, persons that directly or indirectly control or is controlled by or is in common control with another person. So this is an exemption, but it is pretty far reaching where they are going to look at every unit, whether it's single family homes for rent or buildings with multiple apartments contained within it. If it is more than 5, they are not exempt. So further definition of, who is this landlord person under the law? Well, a landlord of a rental unit or rental property includes the owner, the person who is doing the subleasing or leasing, which may be a different party, any person who is authorized to exercise any aspect of the management of the unit, including a person who acts as the rental agent or the person who receives the rent, is processing the payments. So again, partnerships, corporations, associations, LLCs, any other legal entities that offer residential rental units for rent. So including property managers, rental agents, real estate agents, and brokers engaging in rental transactions as well. So we'll kind of review some prohibited behaviors. It's a violation because of the source of income, which is always going to be our base, to deny or terminate because they have Social Security income, to change any prices, terms, conditions, fees, privileges, or facilities or services that come with that rental payment connected to the unit. If I'm paying for it, I should have access to it. Charging extra fees, changing how you screen, not maintaining the units to an equal standard to other units without voucher holders, for example, would be violations. Because of source of income, to simply make the unit unavailable. If the tenant is otherwise eligible, meets all other standing criteria, they should not be denied. It's illegal to represent available units as unavailable or knowingly not include them. So withholding units that are available, for example, from the inspection process because someone receives alimony, or telling a veteran with a VASH voucher that the unit is rented when it has not been, would be a violation. Overall discouragement in advertising. So you'll recognize a lot of this from the earlier law that we reviewed. They echoed a lot of existing fair housing laws. You don't want to have any discouraging rental practices or messages, requiring additional references, ignoring voucher payments when calculating the total income, adding screening criteria, especially if it's unreasonable, placing an ad that has language like working people only or no Section 8 would violate this new law, requiring residents to have a job or work a certain number of hours could be a violation. There's all kinds of income that comes from non-employment sources that are legal and ongoing. And again, just kind of a reminder for West Michigan, we've got Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming that have local source of income protections that have been in place for a long time that protect for legal and verifiable sources of income. So if you aren't sure based on where you're operating, it's a good idea to do that homework. We discourage language that talks about occupation or lack of having an employment or job. Discourage use of language talking about government assistance being received. And again, source of income can be broader here at this local level, alimony, child support, etc. We offer some best practices until we know more. Once case law gets established, I expect we will know more, but until that becomes a body that's available to learn from, and most folks don't want to be the test case to build that case law, we encourage err on the side of inclusion, provide equal treatment to all applicants and tenants, regardless of where their income is coming from, accept and count all income derived from lawful ongoing sources, don't express any limits or preferences about income sources or employment status. Work with any agencies that are administering housing choice vouchers or other assistance that is covered by law in a timely manner. Engage in the process with them. That may include updating your policies and practices as needed to enter into third-party agreements or being set up to accept third-party payments. And retaliation is explicitly prohibited by the law as well. You cannot retaliate against applicants or tenants who are seeking to use these new rights or enforce their fair housing rights. So which of these scenarios would be a violation under our source of income protections? So we'll do a quick review here. Check our learning if I can get it to launch. There we go. So which of these scenarios would be a fair housing violation under the Michigan source of income protection? So we're thinking about statewide protections. Someone with a voucher applies to a property, but they are denied due to recent outstanding rent and unpaid damages. Our second choice is a voucher holder being charged higher rent because their voucher covers more. And our third choice is someone with a voucher putting in a maintenance request and not hearing anything for a month. Their neighbor who doesn't have a voucher has a similar issue and it gets addressed within a week. Which of those do you think would be fair housing violations under source of income protections? And I'll give about 20 more seconds. I'm keeping an eye on the clock to make sure we have time to do our interactive scenarios at the end. I know those are always popular too. Maybe 5 more seconds. And we had some pretty strong agreement on this one. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share. So our first one, someone with a voucher applies to a property, but they are denied recent outstanding rent and unpaid damages, denied due to having recent outstanding rent and unpaid damages. If that's the standard practice applied to every applicant, it would not be a violation to apply that standard, regardless of someone's source of income. So that is not a violation, but 86% and 81% said scenarios 2 and 3 are violations, and I would agree with that. Any being charged higher rent specifically because of source of income is a red flag, and not providing equal maintenance because of source of income is a red flag as well. Great job. We have thrown a lot at you. So we're going to talk about best practices. Many of these, have already been mentioned, but this is a helpful checklist I encourage you to refer back to when you kind of do annual or semi-annual fair housing check-ins. We've had a lot of law change in a short amount of time in the last few years, so you always want to make sure you know your responsibilities and are keeping up to date with any changes, and you know any local laws. If you don't have that information, we gave you resources to look for it, and you can also contact your local fair housing center. Doing a review of application criteria, policies, and procedures is really helpful. Making sure that any of the policies and processes, your application questions don't have any references to protected class without a necessary business justification. For example, you need to know who's going to be on the lease or how many people are seeking to live together as a household. But generally, any other questions we find can be a fair housing risk and violation. So do a review. Make sure you're not collecting information related to protected classes, and make sure, if you are, that you have a business justification for it. Oftentimes we hear, well, we've been asking these questions for years and we don't use the answers. Well, update your form. It streamlines your process, takes away fair housing risk. It's a win-win. And then think about how the application criteria, policies, and procedures are applied. Is anyone potentially being treated differently because of a protected class? And what steps can you take to make sure that doesn't happen? It's all about lowering fair housing risk. Training. You can check that off your list, being on the call with us here today. We will make the recording available. Again, under our MISHA grant, we're doing a series of trainings all year long and offering the videos on our YouTube channel for staff who can't attend. So encourage folks to keep up to date. Making sure that everybody gets training is a good risk management strategy. It's often a question when someone is the recipient of a fair housing complaint against them. They are often asked to respond about training. So do your documentation. Keep those emails that we send you verifying your attendance. Unfortunately, we cannot mail certificates out anymore. The cost and the capacity just aren't there to keep doing that. But we are verifying by email, so you can keep those documents. And make sure that anyone who's representing the housing opportunity or providing housing related services has a baseline awareness of fair housing responsibilities and your established policies. And that can include current applicants and potential applicants and current residents. The more information people have, the better. Thinking about consistency, there's so much information that's exchanged during a housing rental process. So vacancies, waiting lists, qualifications and criteria, rental rates, security deposits, any other fees, all the background information that's checked, requested, any rebates or specials, and all of your policies. You want to apply these evenly and consistently across the board, while keeping in mind that a person with a disability can request an accommodation to any policy, procedure, or service. The question is it reasonable? And again, we've got great resources to help you in that area. Communication and consistency, I think, are really key. Making sure all tenants and applicants, as well as all staff, are available and have access to the most up-to-date applicable criteria, policies, and information is really beneficial. You also want to be able to prove the hard work that you're doing to comply with fair housing, and be able to produce your policies, criteria, forms, etc. So that can help establish and document what you do, how you do it, and if needed ever, to defend you against a fair housing complaint. And think about housing choice. The housing market has been shifting a little bit more lately. And so if there is more opportunity, make sure that people have the ability to choose within available units. We want to watch our assumptions, as Bree said, and not remove choice from someone. If they tour property and say, listen, this is not going to work for me. I have a toddler. I don't want to live on a busy corner, or I'm not interested in a unit with a balcony. They made that choice. Write that down. That's great. You want to work with them to help them make that choice. We talked a lot about accommodations and modifications. We have guidebooks on how to process these requests and how they should be requested of you. The Department of Justice has joint statements. I shared the accommodations link in the Q&A, but great resources there to help uphold and kind of process accommodations and modifications. Bree talked a lot about occupancy standards. We also have a step-by-step guidebook that walks through how to do that homework. It's really important to look at local health and safety code or property management code and make sure that you follow that and don't set a restriction that would be lower than that. So we wrote a guidebook to do that, to be helpful with that. Think about accessibility across the property and all amenities, making sure pathways, curb cuts, sidewalks, entrances are kept clear of obstacles and safe to use year-round. And, don't put the trash can in the middle of the curb cut. That does not help anyone, and makes the property inaccessible. Any set-aside spaces, access aisles, and/or parking for accessible use that have been assigned and/or are available to the public should also be kept accessible year-round. All right, I'll say it for one more time. Describe the property, not the people. I think that's the biggest takeaway under our advertising and communications. Focus on your property, your program, your amenities, and not the people. When in doubt, take it out. So having your policies in place and applying them consistently is a great way to sum up everything that we've looked at, but we do want to run some scenarios by you. So I think we're going to have two sets of three three that have two questions each. And so I will get the questions up or the polls up and review our scenarios. So we're kind of thinking about, what do you do? What are the best practices in these possible responses? And you'll need to scroll down to see the options, which I will also verbally review. We have a 65-year-old man who's rented from you for 5 years. He's just begun using a wheelchair. He's asking that you make a reasonable accommodation for his disability by paying for a ramp so he can have easier access to his first floor unit. Our second scenario is a resident who uses a rollator, which is the device pictured there on the screen. It's a walker with wheels and a bench and brakes. So this resident is using a rollator, working with you to have ramps installed at her door and in the common area where other residents and visitors use it. As part of the process, she asks that you maintain both ramps. So for our first scenario, where we have a request for a reasonable accommodation for a man who just started using a wheelchair, that you pay for a ramp so that he can have easier access to his first floor unit. Our first couple of options here. Is it a modification or an accommodation? Do we want to check and see if a ramp will fit in the space that he has selected? Will it be safe and up to code? Do we tell him to use the door off the back deck instead? How we are funded impacts who pays. One option, this is not a reasonable request. Another option, we need a letter from a doctor stating that he has a disability and a disability-related need. For number 2, our rollator user, we have options. She needs to maintain both ramps herself. Second option, we will maintain both of the ramps and charge her a fee to do so. And third option, she needs to maintain the ramp at her door and we will maintain the one to the common area. So I will give maybe 30 more seconds here. Keeping an eye on the clock. Okay. I know we're keeping it short and sweet here, but I'm going to end the poll so we can quickly review our results. So 56% of you caught that our ramp request is a modification. It's something that you can reach out and touch. It's a physical structural change. So that's a bit of a trick point there. So great job picking up on that. And we do have to see if a space will be available for a ramp up to code to fit there. So 54% of you chose that. I would not recommend you use the door off the back deck. And I would not agree that it's not a reasonable request. We have to do the homework to figure out whether it's reasonable or not. I do agree, 36% of you said how we are funded impacts who pays. And then 45% of you said, I need a letter from a doctor stating that he has a disability and disability related need. I would push back here a little bit and say that if you have observed him utilizing a wheelchair, I don't know that we need verification that there's a presence of a disability, and maybe not even for a disability related need. However, many management groups are less face-to-face. And so that is something we would take into account there. But I would question the need for documentation other than the schematics and drawing and code permit for building a ramp and things like that. But for verification, maybe less so. Our second scenario with 2 ramps being installed, one in a private area and one in a common area. The best answer here would be that she needs to maintain the ramp at her door because it's for her individual use, and then the company would need to maintain the one that the public uses in the common area and do not charge any fees for any accommodations or modifications. Okay. Oh, I apologize. I didn't share those results, but I did read them all, so hopefully that was good enough. Let's see, we have 3 and 4. There we go. Number 3, several weeks ago, maintenance orders were submitted by 3 Latine tenants. You notice the more recent orders submitted by white tenants were addressed instead. The original repair orders submitted by the Latine tenants appear to have been ignored. Our fourth scenario is you got an application for a vacant unit from a Black couple with 1 child. After they leave, the white man who lives next door stops in to ask if he can lease the unit for his son, as he doesn't want you to rent it to someone who isn't white. We have options for each question. Our maintenance repair order question, you can talk to the staff to learn more. You can provide training about equal treatment. It depends on the type of repairs, might be another factor. And our final option, there is no fair housing risk here. For our second scenario, where you have a neighbor who doesn't want you to rent to someone who isn't white and wants to apply, our first option, take the application from his son. Our second, process the family's application because your policy is first come, first serve. Number 3, document everything that was said. 4, take the son's application ahead of the family. And 5, call the Fair Housing Center. I'll give about 30 more seconds here as well. And I think you can keep an eye on the chat with Bree to look at getting the link for the evaluation and attendance verification as well. Okay, end our poll and share our results. So our first question is unequal maintenance based on race. Definitely want to talk to the staff to learn more. Definitely want to provide training about equal treatment. And you do want to find out about the type of repairs. If you've got emergency repairs, certainly those can go to the front of the line. But nobody said there is no fair housing risk here. And so thumbs up on that. I would agree this is risk here under fair housing and needs further investigation. Our second or fourth question here is about a man who wants to jump the line, so to speak, and apply for his son. Take the application. Certainly you can take the application, but most of you, 85%, said process the family's application. They were there first. Definitely document everything that was said, and call the Fair Housing Center. We're happy to kind of talk it through and give you information that can help educate that neighbor that you cannot be required to discriminate. Yeah, so great. And then our last ones here, 5 and 6. We have a family of 4 living in a 2-bedroom. They have a baby, their 3rd child. This makes them a family of 5. The unit is 949 square feet. According to local code, it holds 4 people. Their lease is not up soon, so we give you some options to consider. You can begin paperwork to make them move out. You can, if they don't ask for a larger unit, they should not be forced to relocate. That's an option. It's usually reasonable to give the family at least through the end of their lease and even up to the child's 2nd birthday to vacate the premise. Our last option, consult local ordinances, Fair Housing Center fact sheet and guidebook. Our last scenario, you're reviewing an application from a young couple with 2 children. They appear to be qualified, but you notice that the wife has a felony conviction and just spent the last 3 years in a state prison. Our options are automatically deny them, or it depends on what your property's policy is. So I'll give you about 5 seconds to quick throw your votes in because I'm keeping an eye on the clock. And again, encourage you to click the link in the chat to make sure you get the evaluation, and we will try to address more questions as we can. I'm going to go ahead and share our results here. And so best practice for our occupancy question is that it's usually reasonable to give the family at least through the end of the lease, and depending on the dates and the ages in question, up to the child's 2nd birthday. Definitely consult local ordinances and our materials. If they don't ask for a larger unit, they should not be forced to locate. 28% of you selected that one, and I would agree. I would not begin paperwork to make them move out. Our last scenario about a young couple where we have a felony conviction revealed, it depends on what your property's policy is, so apply your policies there. Okay, great job on those. Briefly want to talk a little bit about how we investigate housing violations that are alleged and brought to us. We train volunteers who essentially act as home seekers and visit housing opportunities and housing related services, and essentially take down information about how they were treated. Is there a difference? Was there a change in the quality, content, or quantity of information based on the protected class that they represent? This is an important part of establishing patterns and practices of discrimination. We look at things like availability, price, terms and conditions, information exchanged, and treatment, all based on protected classes. So if we suspect disability-based discrimination, we would send out a trained volunteer with a disability and someone without. They are trained and retrained and do practice tests. We follow very standard procedures. It's very objective. We have very specific forms and processes. They don't know what they're investigating, and we essentially do side-by-side comparisons, and that's really where the differences can come clearly out to kind of take some of the mystery away of housing testing. If you find weird questions or strange behavior, that is not a tester. Our volunteers are trained very, very carefully and act very professionally. Here's a summary of the difference column that I saw mentioned. You can see there was a difference in both testers seeking 2 bedrooms, but the black tester was only told about a 1-bedroom. There was a difference in information being given about the wait list, which was only given to the black tester. The rental rate for a 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom was the same, which showed a difference based on race. And then also credit, background, and income information varied. The white tester was given information about a cable package and hiking and trails and pools and the carport. And so when you kind of look at those experiences side by side, we can establish that there were certainly differences in information exchanged and treatment here. I encourage you to use the Equal Housing Opportunity logo and the poster provided. We don't have those anymore, but you can look online for those. We encourage that that information be utilized broadly in any places where the property is available to inquire about housing. Some MISHDA specific resources. They have a great fair housing page. They have a fair housing policy statement. There's compliance specific for rental housing and property managers. Again, wanted to give information for those LIHTC, low income housing tax credit properties, and HCV specific programs. So check those out if you're MISHDA funded and those apply to you. Check out our website. We've got tons of good information on there, and want you to know about an upcoming event that we're hosting in April. We've got 2 cool workshops. One will be a legal update with retired fair housing attorney, and the other will be an author speaking about his book about fair housing and health. So that's a free event that we're really excited about. And then we have other MISHDA trainings coming up, other 101s that are similar to this one. And then we have a source of income for renters' rights and responsibilities on April 28th. We encourage you to think about donating to the Fair Housing Center or your local Fair Housing Center. You can become a member and show your support to us today. And finally, some specifics on our evaluation. Please complete this by the end of the day tomorrow by 5 p.m. If you don't do that, we may not be able to verify that you were online with us, and we can't provide any email confirmation. You must complete the evaluation individually. Everyone who's online, even if you're watching in a group, must complete it individually yourselves. Share the link if you're attending as a group. As I mentioned, we can't mail certificates out anymore. We're doing email confirmations only. So look for that email and save it. And we will also share the evaluation link by email to those of you online only here with us today. Anything else I missed, Bree?
Just a note for anybody that is watching this as a recording, you are not able to complete this link if you're reviewing this as a recording. This is only available for people watching it live and is available until tomorrow, March 5th by 5 p.m. So thank you everyone for being here and attending today. We really appreciate it. There is a few more questions in the Q&A that Liz and I will go over, but if you are all set and you have the link, you're welcome to log off. Thank you so much.